answers to questions that I already know. I could build me a castle with memories just to have somewhere to go. Count the days and the nights that it takes to get back in the saddle again. Feed the pigeons some clay, turn the night into day, and start talking again when we know what to say. I'm going down to the Greyhound station, gonna buy a ticket to ride. I'm gonna find that lady with 2 or 3 kids and sit down by her side. The sun comes up and down around about 2 or 3 times, smoking cigarettes in her last seat. Sing my song for the people to meet and get along with it all. Where the people say, oh, feed the pigeons some clay, turn the night into day, and start talking again when I know what to say.
Controller. While I was active duty, I earned a Master's of Science in Homeland Security and an undergrad in Criminal Justice, and worked as a 911 operator and first responder. Those things that I had in the Air Force, a living wage, guaranteed housing, universal single-payer health care, those are the things that I think we should not be denying to people in our communities, to our families, to our nation as a whole. And so I really appreciate you being here. And I'm also going to welcome our guest today. I'll have Mike introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Yestramski. I am a social worker by trade at Western State Hospital here in Lakewood, Washington, but I am also the president of the Washington Federation of State Employees, AFSCME Council 28. Quick disclaimer, I'm not here representing WFC or AFSCME. I'm here as myself, but to talk about labor and labor issues with Chris. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I appreciate it, Mike. And I also want to encourage people, send us questions this whole time while we're talking so that our staff and volunteers can bundle them all up and we can answer them later. Also, for our folks behind the scenes, I'm getting some reverb here in my own voice and a slight delay in the headphones. If there's anything we can do about that. So send those questions our way. I'll also mention, Mike, I don't know if I've mentioned to you that my grandfather actually was a Teamster delivery driver. So he was union, and my grandfather was with UTU when he worked for the railroad, and part of the trade union when he did HVAC repair. And seeing how that benefited their lives is something that I really hold dear. My grandfather was a graduate high school with just a high school education, going in an entry-level job. He was able to raise a family of five on that single income. And it was because of organized labor, because of people working and using their voices as one. And later in life, he ended up becoming anti-organized labor while collecting his pension and Social Security, and having been able to hold on to that job for decades, and having incredible health care. And then my mother's side of the family, they didn't have the quality union employment, and my grandmother ended up breaking her ankle at a supermarket. They didn't have enough money to sue, and so they ended up with, in the 80s, hospital bills that were the size of phone books, and they ended up going bankrupt in the 80s from our for-profit healthcare system. So just looking back over what my parents and grandparents had to deal with and what my peers deal with, it's just so clear that organized labor really means people making more money and having better lives. So
yeah,
I wanted to.
It's definitely. I was going to say, yeah, and I agree. I think one of the things that is really important too with that is it's one of the few areas in the United States in our economic system where workers still have a voice on the job. And that's how you do it, is by coming together collectively, forming a union and having that voice. Management has never given anybody anything out of the goodness of their hearts. It's something that people have fought for to get for the working class.
Yeah, absolutely. That's our opportunity to come together. It's workplace democracy, and I love that term. So what are some of the policies that you'd really think would strengthen workers' rights and the quality of life for most Americans?
So if you're speaking, specifically around to labor, there's actually a bill that just passed in the U.S. House, hasn't even gotten a vote on the Senate, probably won't under our current Senate majority. The PRO Act, which would make it easier for employees to form unions. I think one of the other big things coming up in November, with a lot of these elections, is both the National Labor Relations Board, currently stacked in a very anti-labor majority, and then of course the Supreme Court affects a lot of things. But you look at the 5-4 decision made in the AFSCME versus Janus case that overturned 40 years of precedent in the Abood case around union fees. So basically it created the free rider, the fact that someone can benefit from all the work that union members do without having to pay their fair share. And if you think about that in any other industry, if I just walked into a grocery store and filled up my cart and walked out and pointed to the guy next to me and said, well, he has to pay for my groceries too, A, people will either stop going to that grocery store, or B, that grocery store is going to go out of business, right? So it's the same kind of thing. And I think that's one of the things that does concern me with this upcoming election is, if we don't get a big change, both in the White House and in the Senate, and maintain and strengthen what we have in the House as far as pro-labor, they could be putting into place policies and appointments that could damage the working class for generations to come.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think in this country, we run our businesses like dictatorships. And having democracy, in every facet of our society is only going to strengthen how it is. A part of the brilliance of what our founders created was the idea that the keys to power should be in as many hands as possible. And we need that when it comes to having our voices heard in the workplace as well. It's part of why I support if 51% of employees in an organization want to organize, that they should be guaranteed that right and guaranteed to be able to negotiate for first contract, and that the government shouldn't be doing any business with organizations that fire people for attempting to organize, because that's your right. That's part of freedom of speech. That's part of freedom of assembly. Yeah?
Right.
Yeah, that's what we need to be fighting for. Oh, Amazon, yeah.
Right.
Feel free to take a second to talk about Amazon if you want. I won't stop you.
Right. Well, they just fired. They had some people that were trying to organize their warehouse out in New York, and then they fired all of them. And union busting is incredibly real, especially in businesses. And again, going back to the National Labor Relations Board, which has actually upheld an employer's right to force employees to do closed-door anti-union meetings during a card check, during a union election, just all these various forms with that. So, and I think that the other thing that's incredibly important, just when you mentioned democracy, that I think with union is a true democracy in the sense that, at my workplace, I'm a social worker, and I work with people who are nurses, who are mental health techs, who are custodians, who are food service workers, and regardless of what our job class is, regardless of what our salary is, when we go to our local meeting and we make a vote, my vote counts the exact same as, again, the food service worker, the custodian, the RN. We're all truly one person, one vote, and it's a democratic rule as far as how we move forward as an organization. And again, I think it's one of the last true bastions of true democracy in our society right now.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing that in the national electorate, the way that a minority of voters in the country can end up with an outsized influence. Their votes end up counting for more than someone that if they just moved an hour away. Suddenly their vote becomes less valuable. Presidential candidates spend 95% of their time in 14 states. And so there's a lot of work to do here, but what we're finding throughout this district is when you're just straightforward with people, when you're sincerely looking for the best answers you can actually find, when you're trying to increase people's freedom, people's livelihoods, people's opportunity, people's economic mobility, that language resonates. And it's just about breaking through the bubble that the mainstream media creates, because the era where you can just assume one party or another is pro-labor, is pro-people, it's over. We need to show people every single day and renew that commitment. So when Amazon does something like that, union busting, it's despicable and should have serious results. I was learning about in India how British companies would go there and commit all these heinous crimes, and when people tried to rise up and actually just be treated like humans, they were treated terribly, killed, and faced so much oppression. We're doing that today. We have companies like Coca-Cola that around the world are accused of things like actually having people killed when they try to organize and just get basic human rights protections.
Well, and we're still having that in the United States, even. If you think in the early 1900s, there's a very popular, Solidarity Forever Union song, actually came out of Everett, the port of Everett. There was some longshoremen that were trying to organize for, I don't know if they're actually called longshoremen, but ship workers at the time, who were trying to organize for better conditions. And the National Guard killed them, were shooting at them. And where Solidarity Forever came out of is they were huddled, on this ship, and they started singing that, getting all out there. You look down in Chehalis, Washington, there was a major massacre of labor organizers there from the Wobblies. I want to say that was in the 1910s, but I could be wrong. But then you even look today, there was a pretty famous, it was a big story a couple months ago where there was a giant ice raid down in the South at a lot of these meatpacking plants. where all of these undocumented people were picked up by ICE, what was left out of that story in the mainstream media was it was actually the management of those meatpacking plants that called ICE, and they called ICE after the workers started talking about unionizing. And the management actually told the workers who were not pro-union to stay home that day, and then called ICE on all the people who came in who were pro-union and had them all deported and detained. So again, that was union busting, and while not as blatant as actively firing on them from the National Guard, they also were threatening, those people's lives. I mean, some of those people may have died, either whether in ICE detention centers or being sent back to, villages and countries that were, run by cartels and things like that. So, and again, they didn't call ICE because, they were upset with their work or anything. They were fine with undocumented workers working for no money. But when the workers got together and said, hey, we deserve some safe working conditions, we deserve an honest day's work for an honest day's pay, then they called immigration on them. And, so,
I think
so again, that still happens today in this country.
CEOs, managers, generals, senators, we need to be sending a lot more folks from those communities to jail for these kind of criminal activities. If you got a problem with, say, undocumented workers being hired, send the managers to jail. That'll stop it real quick. You got a problem with us,
right,
as I do, I have a problem with us committing human rights abuses, committing torture, because it's hard to say you're the good guys when you're torturing people. You don't just send staff sergeants to jail. If you really are committed to stopping that from happening, you're sending generals to jail. You're sending people to The Hague who've sent you into those conflicts. And to that extent, something I like to tell people when they talk about small government, the government isn't the only organization that governs your life. Corporations, businesses, your employer, they all play a role in governing your life. And so if you want to make sure that you as an individual have the maximum amount of influence and the maximum amount of self-determination, then we need guide rails. We need to make sure we protect that. Because a corporation versus one person will always win. But a corporation versus a lot of people, that's where we have a chance. And we can control labor on a large scale.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I would say that corporations actually have even more of a control over our lives than traditional government, right? Because they're able to play both parties. They're able to play outside of the, again, the rules and the lines that dictate traditional politics, both within the country and then within the rest of the world, to have that outside influence, not to get too in the weeds, but, with Citizens United, their ability to spend indiscriminately, all of that. And like you mentioned, the way to fight back against that is to understand that at the end of the day, like, we are the laborer. We are the ones who produce the wealth for these billionaires. Right now, I've said this a couple times. I know, Chris, you've said this, and I know other people have said this too. You look at right now in this current crisis, what we're dealing with right now. Who's considered an essential worker? Who's the person that's keeping society moving? It's not Wall Street, it's not hedge fund managers, it's not these big CEOs, it's custodians, it's fast food workers, it's, delivery drivers, and of course, healthcare providers and all that stuff. And a lot of jobs that just 2 months ago, everyone in society said, these people aren't important, you don't deserve $15 an hour, you're replaceable. And then now here we are in this crisis, and these are literally the people that are keeping society from just collapsing.
Absolutely. That's what we're seeing. And no matter what part of our district we go to, the most rural areas to the most populous areas, when I say to people, if you work 40 hours a week and you work hard for that time and you work honestly for that time, shouldn't you be able to have a roof over your head? Shouldn't you be able to have a car like my grandfather could? He raised a family on a single income starting as an entry-level delivery driver. Who doesn't deserve that? That sounds like the American dream. That sounds like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what we're fighting for, and they're going to try and take it away from us every day. I had an interesting experience I haven't spoken about. It just happened in the last week, but this just made me think of it. So there's something you do when you're running for office. You call people up and you ask them to donate. And there was a number I called, and the gentleman said, we had a long conversation, and he was talking about how he had considered running for office years before and saw how hard it was to fundraise and how pretty much became his job to be a fundraiser when he really just wanted to try and help people. And he's a business owner. And he said, you know what I realized? Why run for office when you can just buy politicians? And that's really, Michael Bloomberg said it in a debate. Slip of the tongue, Michael Bloomberg said, I bought the Democrats 12 seats. That's how they think of it. And so in my eyes, labor is crucial. Organized labor is crucial for regaining our power as the working class, as average citizens, as people who are trying to raise our families and being robbed, and the government is helping with that process. They rob us and they give it to corporations, and then we have to beg for measly portions. So it's labor and electoral politics. It's not just one or the other. We need both of them to win this battle. We fight for people to get elected who are actually going to defend us and who are going to fight corruption, because if I get one thing accomplished when I get elected, it's going to be getting people who are representatives but not serving their country, serving themselves, some of them thrown in jail, some of them removed in office. I'm here to be an anti-corruption candidate, because that's how we serve the working Americans, the 99%, and the world and our communities. And labor, we need general strikes. We need solidarity. We need folks saying, all right, Amazon, you're going to do this to your employees? We're going to hurt you where it counts. That was one of the first lessons my mother ever taught me. She said, Christopher, vote with your dollar. Use your vote, use your dollar. That's how we're going to make a statement. And
yeah, there's she's the president of the flight attendants union. This is I refer to it as my labor fanboy that I do with her. Her name is Sarah Nelson. People should look her up. She's great follow on Twitter and Facebook, and incredibly intelligent, super smart, super aggressive, fighting for the working class. And great example of that was about a year and a half ago when we had the government shutdown. The federal government had shut down. It was going, a couple of weeks, not getting nowhere, right? Sarah Nelson came out and said, hey, you know what? We're shutting down the airlines. We're just not, general strike, not happening. And even though she only controlled the flight attendants, she was able to get the air traffic controllers, the pilots, and everybody else as part of that whole industry to get behind her. So we're in this impasse where nothing is happening. Sarah Nelson calls for this strike, shuts down LaGuardia, shuts down O'Hare, and in about 8 hours after that, they magically come up with a solution and reopen the government and all of that. Because, and again, that shows that power that is in our labor and withholding our labor if need be, right? Because like we keep saying, it's not the CEOs that are out there, picking your fruit, building your houses, stuff like that. It is the laborers doing that. So you should be paid accordingly for that work. You should be, recognized for that work. And a quick aside with that too, none of us are out here saying that, we all should be paid $10 million and drive Ferraris and live in McMansions and anything like that. All we're saying is that, like you mentioned, Chris, earlier, that American dream of, it is not an unreasonable expectation for a person who works a full-time job, to serve whatever they serve as far as their job, to be able to make enough money that they can buy groceries, that they have a place to live, and maybe they can go to the beach for a couple days every year, right? that's not a crazy thing, not an unreasonable expectation, but that's not the reality for the majority of Americans right now. So, but I think we can get there, and the way we do that is, like you said, we take over, both in the electoral politics, and we re-energize the labor movement to understand that we truly are the ones who have the power, and we truly are the ones who move our economy.
It's and that's a great point. It's really interesting looking at just how far behind we are other developed nations. When you hear people say, "Oh, any minimum wage increase will massively increase inflation," we spent decades increasing the minimum wage every single year. We just stopped in the last 20 years. Inflation has skyrocketed. If somebody's willing to work for something, to produce something, they deserve to be compensated fairly for their time. And so things that I had in the military, like 30 days of paid vacation a year, safe working conditions, a chain of command that you could actually route concerns up, all those sorts of things, living wage, guaranteed housing, guaranteed food, universal single-payer healthcare, those are all things millions of our service members have. My mom can't join the military. I have disabled friends who can't join the military. Why don't they deserve that dignity? And beyond that, the pragmatic value of it. I saw how our community was strengthened because you could go to school on the side. I was able to get my education. By the time I left the Air Force, I had a higher degree than my commander without incredible debt. I was supposed to do the elbow. Darn it, I'm going to get some hand sanitizer after this. I totally did it into the hand. Shoot. But anyway, so there we go. So I'm trying to, let's see where we're at on time. Good. We still have some more. I'll also encourage people, again, send your questions, throw them our way. And so let's talk stimulus package real quick. What are some things, if you don't mind commenting or if you feel up to it, that you would have liked seen contributed to the stimulus package that was just put out?
So I think, what are we on, the third iteration of those now? The CARES Act and all of that. There were a couple good things in there, right? But I think, again, the big thing that I felt was missing, was, first off, when you look at pure dollars and cents, a lot of that money still went, again, to the corporations, to the top 1%, as opposed to, the working class and the people who really need it to survive. Especially you look at like gig economy people, service workers. Think about right now in Washington State, how many, again, bartenders, waiters, waitresses, hairstylists, tattoo artists, what have you, who literally cannot work. They can't. It's illegal for them to work right now, and are making $0. Like that $1,200 stimulus check. Like, yeah, that's better than nothing, but that's maybe a month's worth of rent or a portion of a month's worth of rent, depending on where you live in the state. I would have liked to have seen a lot more bolder stuff in that sense of, here in Washington State, for instance, we had the eviction moratorium, which is great, but that just means that whenever that's lifted, if you couldn't pay your bills then, now you owe double rent next month. I would like to see a national freeze on rents and on mortgages, and possibly some other, big financial bills as far as that goes. Like I said, a commitment to getting more money into the pockets of workers. And I also think that, I believe it was Elizabeth Warren's plan, if I remember correctly, who, as part of it, said that any of these companies that get bailout money, they can't use it for bonuses, for CEO pay, that it actually has to be used to pay their workers. Some limits on that, I think, would be some just kind of minor thing. Well, minor in the sense of, easy things, I guess, is a better way to do it.
Yeah, I think being tough on
common
justice
sense things
means...
of, again, putting that money.
Oh, sorry. I consider myself tough on justice, tough on crime. If you're going to use taxpayer dollars to go do some stock buybacks or give yourself a bonus, you belong in a cell. That's the taxpayers' money
Right.
that we use to try and help your industry. And in the last two bailouts, it was because of mismanagement, because they just know they're going to get another. If you really believe in competition, if you believe in the free market, stop throwing money at failing businesses, failing giant multi-billion-dollar corporations. Help small businesses. I don't even hear either party talking about small businesses anymore. I don't hear that conversation even happening. But if the opportunity to actually give people the chance to start their own business and compete and maybe make better products, that's not even being paid lip service at this point.
Right. Well, and if you really, I was going to say with small businesses too, this might not sound related, but hear me out. If you really believed in small business, I think one of the things the government would also do would be a support of supporting an overhaul of our healthcare system, a true single payer type system, because how many people might want to start their own small business, but they can't because their healthcare is tied to their employer, so they can't leave, whatever big corporation they work for. Let's say me, right? I'm a social worker by trade. What if I wanted to open up my own private practice? Under the current rules, I'd have to find my own health insurance. I'd also have to go through all the various health insurance billing, which is a whole nother aspect of it. As opposed to if that was something I didn't have to deal with, I could open a business. Then maybe I hire an office assistant. I hire a second therapist if my business starts really kicking out, and then that is helping, the small business, as we say, and really pushing that economy forward. So I really believe that healthcare is tied specifically to the economics. I'm also going to say my experience with unions too. With union experience, imagine how much better I could bargain for wages and working conditions if I didn't have to spend the amount of time and energy and political capital bargaining for health insurance for my members. We spend an abnormally large amount of time just on healthcare bargaining because it's important. It's very important that we make sure that our members have great healthcare. But in order to do that, to ensure that people have the healthcare they need, again, that's a lot of resources that we spend that could be used in other aspects to improve other aspects of people's lives.
Absolutely, it's and part of the, it's part of our healthcare system is about reducing competition, reducing people's choice, making it so people are terrified to leave a job, reducing our bargaining power because your life is on the line if you lose that job, especially if you have a chronic illness. And then these companies can also honestly say, our healthcare costs are going up. It costs us more money to give you the exact same amount of coverage, so we're not going to give you a pay raise. Or you can take less coverage and we'll give you a pay raise, but it doesn't help our bottom line. So employer-based healthcare is an impressive feature of our society. Now, I will ask you, what can people do? What can I do as someone running for Congress, and what can an average person do to try and strengthen unions in our country, strengthen organized labor?
So, both for someone running for Congress, and then again, like we mentioned, there's just helping with a lot of the pro-labor bills that might come out that, again, strengthening people's ability to join unions. You mentioned the 51%, the card check, instant recognition, those sort of things. As a legislator, as a regular person, so to speak, support people who would, running for office, who would support those things. I think one of the other things that's important, you mentioned voting with your dollar. Look at what companies are union companies versus not union companies. Say if you're buying a vehicle or going to a grocery store, and that matters. Like, go to the union grocery store, buy a union made automobile. things like that. And, back when people wrote checks, there were people's checks would actually say on them, paid for with union job, with a union job and things like that. And people would use those at the grocery stores, especially during, contract negotiations around that, are some of the big things. And then also if you work in an industry, that already is unionized, join your union, and get involved. And if you happen to work at somewhere that is not currently unionized, I encourage you to look into organizing, and actually becoming unionized in your workplace. Now, I'm going to put a little caveat with that, though, of if you start doing that, be very careful, because as we said, if an employer finds out that you're, talking about forming a union, like, they will probably try to fire you, before you can get that momentum going. There was an example of a Walmart store a couple of years ago where the employees actually successfully did an organizing drive, and rather than recognize the union, Walmart shut down the store and fired everyone in the store. So the other thing that I would say with that is, if you are considering trying to do an organizing drive, I would reach out to, your local AFL-CIO affiliate, or you can reach out to me, Mike Y at WFSE.org, and I can kind of point you in whatever direction need be. If it's not my sector, I probably know someone whose sector it would be, who could help you navigate that piece to make sure that you're getting the organizing together, you're getting the contract you want, the working conditions you want, but also, again, protecting you and your coworkers from that anti-union retaliation that would likely be coming if the big boss was to find out what was going on before you got to a point that you were ready to file.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, too, the precarious position we're in now, where so many people have been laid off unfairly, where businesses take all this money and the government says, please don't lay people off, and then they get laid off. And the company still takes the money, because a business's job is to make more money, right? And so if they can receive a bailout and fire their employees, that's the move that makes them the most money. So they're going to do both of those things. And so it's tough, if we had spent the last few years sacrificing more, as tough as that is, and maybe organizing, more cohesively as a nation, we wouldn't be in this position now. We people could have savings accounts. That's one of my favorite things to talk about when I'm speaking, because like I said, I'm a working class millennial. That's what I am. I'm average guy. That's what I want to see more of in politics too. That's why I'm doing this, and I know that so many folks I speak to just think it would be so great to have a savings account with a few $100s in it. Imagine being able to tuck away a little bit of money each paycheck, and then I say, please turn in your ballot so that we can do that,
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's, again, right now that we're, the reality is if we haven't already officially gone into it, we will be in an economic depression very soon, right? And you hear a long talk with that, as well as talks just about debt and all those things in general. The money managers who are like, well, you should always have 2 months worth of salary and savings, or all of this and all that. And it's like, yeah, that's great. I would love to be able to do that. I would love for everyone to be able to do that. But the reality is, when you're working 40 hours a week, plus maybe another 20 hours a week at another job somewhere else, and at the end of the day, by the time you pay your rent, your health insurance premium, your medication co-pays, again, you buy food, pay for daycare if you have children, and all of those kind of things, you don't then have enough money to save, and I think, again, not to get too off into the weeds, but we have this weird thing in our society where we view poverty almost as if it's this like moral failing, that you just didn't, if you didn't work hard enough, or you didn't do this. And I have to say that, frankly, that that pisses me off, because I can tell you, both from people in my own family and then my own personal experience and the people that I see every day that are the poor, so to speak, like those people are working their asses off. The person that's working 3 part-time jobs with no health insurance, no benefits, no days off, again, to feed them and their families, that's not a lack of desire. That's not a lack of effort. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's a lack of opportunity, and it's someone that, our system is rigged against. And, unfortunately, the people who are in charge of the system right now, because it's rigged in their favor, they're not going to change it. The only way to really change that system, to unrig the system, so to speak, is to put, people who actually are from the working class and believe in the working class in charge of that system.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it too. It's interesting. We had a talk with one of our people who was advising me about different, just being more aware of how I communicate. And they said that in America, and this isn't true anywhere else, saying someone's a hard worker is equivalent to saying they're a good person. And it's just this thing that we've had for a long time. And what I think about in those circumstances is more than just the folks who are working, couples with a family who are working 4 jobs, so they never get to see their kids, but that's the only way they're going to put food in their kids' mouths. But I also think about the 20% of people living on the street who have schizophrenia. 20% of people with schizophrenia are homeless. 1 out of 5. Imagine if that was cancer. Imagine if that was diabetes. It's horrific. What a failing, what a moral failing of our society. And people act as if, what are you going to do? Well, we made a few $1 trillion materialize overnight so we could fix the Dow Jones while tens of millions are out of work. We can't do something about the 1/5 of people with schizophrenia who, because they don't, if another interesting fact, if we didn't have Social Security, half of our population over 65 years old would have 0 savings. They would just be out on the street, or hopefully have children to take care of them. What a radical policy. Say, hey, we're going to take a chunk out of your paycheck for your entire life, and the majority of people are never going to receive that money because they'll pass or a ton of other things. But if you make it to 65, you're going to get a check each month. And that was a very ambitious policy. There was a point in U.S. history where 20% of our workforce was children. And you know what? There were plenty of businesses who said that was a heck of a grievance. If you're going to end child labor at our cotton mills, what are we going to do about the spaces that only a 10-year-old can fit? And part of the racism of that time was they just ended child labor for most white children. But if you were a person of color, or also other new migrant communities, such as the Irish community, their 10-year-olds working was okay. And so we have that progress to make still, and I think 20 years from now, if you and me and a lot of other folks do our jobs right, we'll be looking back at some of the labor policies of today and be very grateful that we moved past them.
Well, I agree, and I think mentioning that with the child labor laws, and again going back to some of the things that have come out of the Labor Relations Board and some of the labor laws. So I think that it's important to remember that every labor law that has been passed in this country, despite how they're framed, was passed either to take away the power of the labor movement, to corral them, or to placate the working class, right? To make them think that they had something, and it goes back to this idea, in my opinion, that, labor laws are important, and are definitely a tool that the working class can use to, retake our power in our economy, but they're only a tool. They're not the only tool, because, as I mentioned before, the laws are going to be written by the people who are in charge. And under our current system that is rigged for the wealthiest people are the ones who are going to be in charge, and they're going to set the laws to benefit them. So again, the way we do that is we take that power back, both by getting labor-friendly, actually working-class people in office to set those laws, but also again by re-emphasizing that we are the economy, we are the ones that control that power, and to wait and think that some magnanimous billionaire is going to wave a magic wand and save the working class is a fantasy. It's not going to happen. The way it's going to happen is that we as workers are going to come together and stand in solidarity and say we want that power back, and if they refuse, then we take it back. So I'm a bit of a militant, I guess, in that point, but still.
Civil disobedience matters, and I think also throughout history, a request for civility is something that is just meant to try and quiet folks. We have power, but it only comes through uniting. That's it.
Right.
We are the source of wealth in this country, as the working class, as people who create things, as people who show up every day. And like you said, these laws are either placating us or decreasing our voice, decreasing our power. If you're pro-freedom, you're pro-organized labor, you're pro living wage, the military has all those benefits, not because of some sense of altruism in the government. The last thing any government wants to do is have their military underpaid, underfed, underhoused, because then they have a real threat. Well, you know what? That goes for the rest of the population too. As a veteran, I'm saying, as a population, we need to demand that we have living wages, that we have housing, affordable housing, that we have food available. That is within our grasp, and as you said, it's not just electoral politics. It's not just getting laws passed. It's finding other ways to make your voices heard. And so I think we're going to move to the Q&A now. Do we got any questions for the Q&A? Oh, okay, got it. And I don't know, are any of them going to be for Mike? Oh, both of us can answer. Cool. All right. By the way, I like all the green, Mike. It's kind of a green Power Ranger thing you got going on.
Well, it's the AFSCME green. This is backwards. Nice. So this is my favorite AFSCME shirt because it doesn't, other than the sleeve thing, doesn't have a lot of union logos. It just says activist, and on the back in big letters it says vote.
I'm going to get one of those shirts. I want one of those shirts. I'm mentioning it. I'm getting one of those shirts. You're going to see pictures of me wearing it, by the way, because that's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see some questions we may have on.
And then this is my quarantine union bandana because I've been doing lots of video conferences and all the barbershops are closed. So
that was something we were just talking about. I am starting to get a little unruly over here. Let's see. How do we counter corporations' anti-union propaganda and middle management whose salary depends on crushing organization among employees? And that comes from our good friend Magnus. So what do you I'd love to hear your answer, Mike.
So I think one of the best ways to kind of work back against any sort of anti-union propaganda or anything like that is to what I refer to as inoculation. So FYI, my dog Jersey just decided she wanted to join the call. So she heard me talking and she decided she needed to get on the couch. But yeah, so getting back to the inoculation piece, I think is really key. And what that means is simply, a one-on-one conversation with, your coworkers, with your neighbors about what the value of being a part of a union is. And no spin, no BS. You don't need to, do any of that. My experience really has been that when you speak to people and you speak the truth to power, this is what being in a union has done for me. This is what it could do for you. This is what it has done for society. People hear that, people get that, and people want to be a part of it. When you think about these groups out there that are the strong anti-union forces, that are telling you, oh, you don't want to pay union dues or this or that. Why would Delta Airlines spend, tens of hundreds of millions of dollars in anti-union propaganda, union busting, labor firms, and all of this kind of stuff to save you, $100 a month in union dues? Is it because they're that magnanimous and that, charitable of an organization? No, it's because they know that is what keeps them being able to keep you under the thumb. And that if you, again, I'm using Delta as an example, were to come together and unionize, that all of a sudden those workers would have the power. And think about how much, too, that must cost them, because if they're willing to spend tens of millions of dollars to crush a union, how much profit then is that company making that they are not sharing with their workers? Because they're not, if it would only cost them, again, it's cheaper for them to spend that kind of money than it would be to actually share their profits with the working class.
Yeah, trust busting is unreal. And having those conversations with people about our right to assembly, about our right to free speech, those are crucial, those everyday conversations. And then supporting people like me who want to make sure that there are severe consequences for corporations that trample over our constitutional rights to assemble and to free speech is crucial. And all the other incredible folks out there who feel the same way, and getting involved yourself too. And so I appreciate that question, Magnus. I like that one. What would you say or do differently to help labor folks believe in me and our politicians? So hopefully, what I've already said, that I saw the benefits my father and grandfather reaped. I'll also say from 1958 to 1964, that was the period where we had the highest union membership in this country. It was about 35%, and that's where when the middle class was the largest it had ever been. Before or since, the bottom 90% of earners had the highest concentration of wealth, and the strength of my grandfather's union compared to my father's unions had a significant impact. But I'll tell you what, I as a child had good health care when my dad had a good union job, and didn't have good health care when he was working with a different employer. And that's not something that a child should have to deal with. That's not something a 10-year-old should have to deal with. So I hope that would convince people to support, to make that the standard. That seems like a fair standard. What would you say, Mike? What do you think people should be looking for when they talk to someone running for office?
So I think, again, to reiterate what you said, when someone's running for office, you want to look for, people who, again, are pro-labor. If you can find someone in a lot of races, you'll see people have already held either a previous elected position or, a business position or things like that. So they probably have a record on support or non-support of workers, of the working class. That's I'm someone that believes very deeply, not just in what people say, but more so in what they do. When you have a chance to actually stand in solidarity with people, do you do that? Again, being in the union that I am, there's a lot of people who are running for office who want endorsements and things like that, which is fine, but it's great, but it's like, sometimes we'll get people who are like, oh, I want you to endorse me because I'm so pro-labor, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but you you didn't vote for this bill, or you voted against this, or when the Providence nurses were out on strike, when there was the boycott of Fred Meyer recently, during their contract negotiations, like things like that. Look for the people who are actually standing in solidarity with those workers. If you claim to be pro-labor, but you're crossing a picket line, you're not pro-labor.
Yeah, I completely agree. Although with the Providence one, so many of us are uninsured that there's probably less of us to cross the picket line. That's the insurance industry for you too. Is their profits have continued to
Right.
increase as millions more people, but that's not going down to the workers. The workers aren't seeing that. There was one point where
Right.
United Health, every 1% of every dollar they brought in went to the CEO. That's what they're doing. They're lining their pockets.
Yes.
And that's why I support a cap on CEO wages, on highest paid employee wages. I don't believe the highest paid employee of a company should receive more than 100 times as much total compensation as the lowest paid employee. And that's something I'm ready to fight for. And a lot of people in business support that as well, actually. They're tired of this arms race of having to pay people more and more and more money. There was a
Right.
good
And when
one.
you
Go
mentioned
ahead.
earlier going back, you mentioned earlier going back to that, late 50s time frame, and you look at again at that point the difference between CEO pay versus the people at the bottom, and yeah, there was a disparity, but it wasn't that great of a disparity. And this idea that back when workers actually made a living wage, back when the super elite paid a high marginal tax rate, we still had a great economy, and on top of that, we still had rich people. We still had the Rockefellers. We still had, people, the Great Gatsby, people out
The
there
Trumps.
driving around in limos and eating fancy dinners. It wasn't like there was no wealth in the country. There was still very, very wealthy elite people, but there was enough of the money going down to the actual working class that people could survive. And that's really the crux of this argument. Is it's beyond even just a what do you want? Like it's literally a survival. It's lack of healthcare, lack of ability to have a roof over your head, as you've mentioned. To feed yourself is legitimately a life or death proposition for a lot of Americans, and it doesn't have to be that way.
Very well put. Well, we'll do one last question, and then I'll close out. I know my opponent and a lot of people in politics like to avoid questions that they don't have a rosy answer for. So I got one for me and you. I'd love your input. So the question is, would you support a flat tax? And my answer is, why not just return to the tax rates of President Eisenhower? I'm an Eisenhower Republican. And I think those were some great tax rates, and they weren't flat, and we managed to have a surplus. And I think that's a strong way to run an economy. It's a way to actually, bring in revenue and take care of people. Because that's what the Constitution says. It says that taxes can be levied for the general welfare, and for having a military. General welfare seems pretty clear what that would stand for. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, not a big fan of flat tax. I think that, again, those ideas, our current tax system is incredibly regressive. You look here in Washington State, we're actually the most regressive state in the country when it comes to taxes, meaning that we put the majority of the cost of running our state on the people who can least afford it. That we have, well, one of those people just recently passed away, and Paul Allen. But prior to that, we had 3 of the 5 richest people in the country lived in the same zip code in this state. In Gates, Bezos, and Paul Allen, and they, again, their marginal tax rate was, the percentage of their income that they paid in taxes was substantially less than the person that cleaned their hotel room last time they stayed at some fancy hotel in Bellevue, and that's just unsustainable. And then you look at right now, because of our broken tax system and our reliance on sales tax and things like that disproportionately affect the poor. that's one of the reasons that our state right now is about to go into a massive depression because of the money that we are losing because of our reliance on the sales tax system. So yeah, and like I said, you go back to those Eisenhower tax rates, or even the Nixon era tax rates,
Reagan,
which
even
are still
Reagan was still
substantially
considerably higher than now.
right. Where people still pay. I mean, and the idea, I think part of it is there's a misunderstanding of what a tax rate is. You hear an 80% tax rate. No, that's 80 cents on every dollar after your $10 millionth dollar, right? I hope that I make enough money that one day I have to worry about an 80% marginal tax rate. Please let that be my future, right? Like we would all be so lucky, but that's not the reality for the majority of Americans. And that's, I think, the other thing that corporations have done so well, unfortunately, is framing that narrative so that people hear you talking about, the marginal tax rates going up, and the guy who is, or gal who is, working at the grocery store thinks that that's on them, right? People talk about the estate tax or the death tax. Oh, I can't leave my family this or that. Yeah, if you have property that's worth $10 million, how many people actually have $10 million that they're going to leave to their children? Not many.
Yep.
So.
Well, and the estate tax had its death knell under President Obama, but in World War II, when it was first created, it was 90%. It was significant. And to me, intergenerational wealth is a far greater threat to the moral fiber of our nation and the practical ability for us to be able to lead and develop and grow than someone who's collecting Social Security or collecting welfare or SNAP or anything like that.
Right.
We end up with a monarchy essentially of wealthy families, Prescott Bush to George H.W. to George, but we'll wrap up here. And I'll say we have our donation link that'll be posted. I understand it's a hard time. I get it. If you can't, don't. Completely fair. We're doing everything we can to keep this campaign moving. When we have the money, we really want to run 2 billboard campaigns that we're excited for related to healthcare. One of them will mention that we don't want to take your gun. We just want you to have good healthcare. And the other one will be universal health care is so complicated and challenging that only 32 out of the 33 top economies on Earth have it. And so those kind of things, just letting people know the kind of things we wish folks knew, that these are entirely achievable. That not only are they not pie in the sky policies, they are actually the standard for most nations, and we are lagging far behind. It's time for us to become moral leaders on top of just economic leaders. So, and we're going to have a speech by Martin Luther King Jr. With photography by Louis Kine. The photography is about child labor, because that's something. We ended child labor in this country. It was a huge part of our workforce. We also ended slavery. That was a huge part. There were a lot of people who said, that's really going to hurt my business. I don't know. Well, guess what? Human life matters. And that we make the right decision. We make the moral decision. That matters. And that's what makes America great. And if we make it so, it doesn't happen on its own. We don't just get to sit back and act like we're perfect. If America was a person right now, what kind of person would we want that one to be? Would we want to be a nation or a person that just says, I'm awesome, forget everybody else, me, me, me? No. Greed will destroy us, but selflessness will tie us together and will make this country great. Do you have any final messages, Mike?
No, I mean, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed this. I hope that it was, informational and educational for people, that they got something out of it. And on top of that, I leave everybody with, which is a